and welcome to a teaching that I believe will make a vast difference in your life and the life of your loved ones. And I truly believe that it's a teaching whose time has come to help so many people that are torn apart by the ravages of divorce and possibly remarriage. You know, divorce is painful enough, and remarriage is difficult enough. But when you throw in the nuance of the church and our teachings that we have always held to concerning divorce and remarriage, it sure doesn't help the struggle that maybe you have had to go through. So if you're watching this teaching, you're one of three groups of people. You're someone that believes in divorce and remarriage, or you're someone that doesn't believe in divorce and remarriage, or you're someone that has no idea. This lesson is going to help you settle the issue forever. After you watch this teaching today, you will never again be tormented by the subject of divorce and remarriage. It's no new revelation because I'm not that smart. But as we go deeper into study, and as we have found some documents and things that we did not have in decades gone by, it has brought more clarity on the subject, and the church needs to redress this subject. Thank you for joining me. I'm Shane Vaughn. I'm your teacher and your host today, and I'm going to ask you, if you would, to share this valuable teaching with someone that might need it. You would be shocked and dismayed at the pain that this subject has caused for so many people. Jesus tells us concerning divorce and remarriage, He said, from the beginning, it was not so. That is the title of this lesson today. From the beginning, it was not so. We taught divorce and remarriage previously in our church and our local congregation, and that video is available on our YouTube channel. If you have not subscribed, you're missing out on some wonderful truth. Make sure you subscribe. But there was audio glitches with that teaching, and many people just could not endure the audio glitches. It was difficult to understand. So we have decided to reproduce and recreate that teaching, and that's what you're watching right now. So let's do this. We're going to put slides up on the screen to help you follow along, and we're going to talk about the subject, divorce and remarriage, and Jesus' words, from the beginning it was not so. Going forward, I will refer to Jesus by His original Hebrew name, the name that His mother called Him, the name that the angels called Him, and that is Yeshua. That way you're not confused when you hear me referring to Him by that name. God created a perfect world. In the beginning, everything was perfect. There was no murder. There was no theft. There was no rebellion. There was no divorce in the beginning. So Jesus was right. Yeshua was correct when He said in the book of Matthew chapter 5, talking about divorce, from the beginning it was not so. But you know, He could have said the same thing about murder. He could have said the same thing about theft. He could have said the same thing about rebellion, and it would have all been true. But it doesn't mean it would have been a reality of the world they were living in. Because truthfully, even though these things were not from the beginning, does not mean that they are not now. Men's hearts are rebellious, and they were inclined towards rebellion from the very beginning of time. There was no murder. So once murder began to creep up into society, there had to be a law enacted that would bring punishment for murder. And that law comes forth from the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, when God gave laws to Moses for the nation of Israel. The penalty for murder was death. There was another punishment enacted for thievery or theft. If you stole something, it had to be repaid 2 times the amount that you stole. They didn't just lock you up, throw away the key. No, they made you repay what you stole twice. For rebellion or rebellious children, the punishment was stoning. They would take you and stone you to teach you not to be rebellious. Now, if marriage was ended or dissolved, there was a punishment for that. The punishment was called divorce. Because the truth is, brothers and sisters, divorce is the punishment for a less than perfect marriage. For a marriage that cannot find a way forward. It's punishment for 2 people that cannot rise to the level of working it out. There's a punishment for it. And that punishment is divorce. Now listen to me carefully. Punishment is not the end. Punishment is to give you a new beginning. When you were a child and you were punished for something, there was almost a relief in the punishment. Why? Because the slate was clean. You could start over. But you had to endure the punishment. I know of anyone or no one that has gone through the pains of divorce that would not rightly describe it as punishment. Maybe it's punishment for selfishness, punishment for whatever it was that caused that marriage to become unworkable. Whatever would cause that marriage to not be salvaged because maybe one person was not willing to salvage it. It brings both people into a punishment, and that punishment is called divorce. I want to say this from the beginning of this lesson. God, whom I will refer to from here on out by his Hebrew name, Yahweh, hates divorce. He absolutely despises divorce. So I don't want anyone that watches this teaching to the very end, and if you watch it to the end, you will be rewarded with great knowledge and understanding. But when I get to the end, I never want it said that I am promoting divorce or even giving it any kind of a stamp of approval. It's horrible. It's painful. I know from experience, there's nothing like it in the world, especially if your children are involved. It is indeed a punishment. God hates divorce. But it is not the divorce that God hates, not the act of divorce, because divorce is a punishment. So it's not the punishment that God hates, it's what led to that punishment. The unfaithfulness or whatever it was that broke up the marriage that led to divorce, that is what God hates. The results are the consequences of our choices. Do you know why God hates divorce? Because he loves covenant. I want you to keep that word in your mind, covenant. When I use the word covenant, I want you to truly grasp what a covenant is. A covenant is an agreement between 2 or more parties. A covenant is a handshake with a promise. A covenant is if I tell you that if you paint my home, you're going to get $1,000 in return. We shake hands on it or we sign an agreement. We have entered into a covenant. God is a covenant-keeping God. So why does he hate divorce? Not because of divorce itself, but because a covenant was broken. And any time we do not honor covenants, it places society in a very bad situation. And indeed, this generation that we live in, are not keepers of covenant, but Yahweh is always a keeper of covenant. Let's turn in our Bibles to Malachi chapter 2 and verse 16. And let's see what the Scriptures have to say concerning this subject. Malachi chapter 2 and verse 16. For Yahweh, the God of Israel, saith that he hates divorce. For one covereth violence with his garment, saith the Lord of hosts. Therefore take heed to your mind, which is your spirit, that you deal not treacherously. He is comparing divorce here to violence. He hates violence. He hates divorce because divorce is violence to the covenant of marriage. So he says that he hates all of these things. He said, I hate divorce. If you love God, then you also should hate divorce. You should do everything within your power to keep from it. You should fight it harder than you fought for your job or your career for your marriage. If not, then you're not a man or woman after God's own heart, because God's heart is covenant. God hates divorce. So if you love God and love divorce, those two things will not go together. Why? Because marriage is the foundation of society. Its destruction is the destruction of society. The reason our society is falling apart, and it is because marriage is falling apart. Marriage is a covenant. It is the creation of God. Did you know that God created marriage? The coming together of one man and one woman. This was his original design for marriage in the very beginning. And the reason being, he claimed this relationship and this institution as his creation. It was the same thing as the Sabbath day. They were both created parenthetically, right there beside each other. Marriage was on the 6th day. The Sabbath was on the 7th day. God is the owner of marriage, and he legitimizes it only through his church, through his ordained ministry. Not the state, not the local courthouse, not the magistrate. They have no authority to marry anybody in the eyes of God. Now, of course, in the eyes of the state, yes, but in the eyes of God, that was not done by the church. And I highly recommend, if you were married by a county magistrate or a judge, I highly recommend for you to go find a true ordained minister of the gospel and to have them to remarry you in a private ceremony by the laying on of hands by the church of the living God. Why? Because God created the Sabbath. He created marriage. These are his, and only he can authorize it. A marriage is an institution of the church. Did you know before the early 1900s that the United States of America did not issue marriage licenses? Only the church issued marriage licenses. The reason being because it is a sacrament of the church, not the state. That is why I don't care who marries two men or who marries two women. They did not do it with the authority of God, so it is fake news. It cannot happen because the Church of the Living God is the only institution authorized to marry anyone. Its design originally is God's pattern forever. However, if God created marriage and it belongs to him, then only God can come up with a way to dissolve marriage. Now, many believe a marriage cannot be dissolved. Why? Because the Bible tells us that the woman is bound to her husband as long as he lives. If that's the case, and that's what that scripture means, then a marriage can never be dissolved until death. And there are many in the Christian church that take that perspective. I once held that perspective. The issue of marriage and divorce has caused great distress to true believers around the world. Now, the world doesn't care. Halfway Christians don't care. But true believers care about God's perspective on this subject. I want to talk about the balance with you today. You have two sides that, in my opinion, are extremely unbalanced. You have one side that says divorce is a sin because God hates it. You have the other side that says marriage is a tryout. Just see if it works out for you, and if it don't, oh well. Both of those are out of balance. And the Bible says a false balance is an abomination to Yahweh. He despises it. He loves the balance. You will always find the true God of Israel in the middle. You will find Him a perfect balance of mercy and grace, law and works. You'll find it all. He's a balance. When it comes to this subject, He will bring you the true balance. But over here, you got the church, some of the conservative members of the church, screaming divorce is a sin. And if you get divorced, they won't use you in the ministry anymore. If you get a divorce, you're pretty much a second-rate Christian. You're looked down upon. And then, like I said, the other side, they could care less one way or the other. Then you have this side of the church that says, if you divorce, you must remain single all of your life or go back to your original wife or husband. They believe that if you divorce, there is never a chance to remarry. You simply must remain single. Then you have the other side over here that says divorce is no big deal whatsoever. Just whatever will be, que sera, sera. Then you go back over here and you've got the fundamental side of the church that says, if you ever remarry after you divorce, you will be living in continual adultery. Now, where do they get that from? They get it from the Bible. From the words of Jesus in Matthew 5, Yeshua, when He said, if a man marries a woman that has a husband, that they're both in adultery. Now, you cannot deny that Jesus said those words. You cannot deny it. He said those words. And before I came to the revelation that I'm going to teach you today, those words paralyzed me when I read them, because there's no getting around them. They're there. But what do they mean? That's the purpose of today's lesson. These are both perspectives that I believe are out of balance. Today, we're going to find the middle ground of truth. Truth normally lies between two extremes. I have found that to be the case. Why is this subject so important? Here's why. Church opinion has long favored the teaching that remarriage after divorce is adultery, based on what they believe to be a single mistranslated word in Matthew 5:32. Let's turn there. Matthew 5:32. And I want to show you where this entire teaching that you can never remarry and that you're living in adultery if you do comes from. And it comes from a pretty important person, the head of our church, Yeshua the Messiah. Let's read Matthew 5:32. But I say unto you, that whosoever shall put away his wife, except for the cause of sexual immorality, causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries her that is divorced commits adultery. Now, folks, that is pretty black and white, in this case pretty red, the red letters of Christ. It's pretty plain. Jesus says, if you put away your wife, you're going to cause her to commit adultery, and whoever marries her is commit adultery. If that's what he means, then you can very easily see where the church gets that other side from that is so strict and so dogmatic. What are the results of this teaching? A great many people today, perhaps your own self, are divorced and remarried, and you have suffered the shame of it in your local churches. While you had this perfect marriage, you were well thought of. You were high up in the echelon of the church. But the moment you went through your divorce, and God forbid your remarriage, you're not stupid. You felt the change, the way people looked at you. Well, those people all mean well. They think they're obeying and honoring the words of Yahshua and shunning divorce and remarriage. So you can't blame their ignorance. When I say ignorance, I don't mean that in a bad way. Ignorance is a lack of understanding. Others are being refused leadership in positions of the church, such as pastors or elders. And they're being piled on a load of guilt because they're living in constant adultery with their new partner, their new wife, their new husband. And it's very tragic. It's very sad. I've watched it. It's a heart-wrenching thing, and it is unnecessary. Many times it turns people away from God altogether, either in rebellion against what they feel is an injustice in the Scripture, or else through discouragement over their own inability to remain single. They get lonely, and they don't know what to do. They know if they remarry, they're committing sin, supposedly. So they just decide to stay single, and then they start living in sin. They don't know what to do because the teaching of divorce and remarriage has paralyzed an entire segment of Christian believers. I've watched it all my life. I want you to look at your screen, and I want you to look at the picture there. What you're going to see is God's ideal, God's goal, and what every family should look like had sin and rebellion never entered into the picture. Look at that. You see grandmother, grandfather, mother, father, children, a place to call home for those children. If your marriage choices are made with nothing less than this perfect picture in mind, then you've missed the point of marriage. Marriage is to create strong, healthy families. Children should never wonder where home is. They should never be put into tug-of-wars between mom and dad fighting after the divorce. And this is all from rebellion, every bit of it. That picture is what the millennial reign will look like. When all sin has left our planet and all rebellion has been quashed, this is what it will look like. According to Matthew 24 and 38, when it says there will neither be divorce or remarriage, which is the meaning of marrying and giving in marriage. There will be no more divorce in the millennial kingdom. All families will look like this picture on your screen. But I'd like for you to look at your screen again. This is the reality of the world you and I live in. We don't live in the millennial. We don't live in the beginning. We live in the now. And the picture on your screen is the reality of our world. How does this happen? Because for the ideal marriage that I just showed you on the previous screen, for the ideal marriage, both parties, I want you to remember this, have to stay faithful to the terms of the covenant. Marriage is a covenant between two parties that have to be agreed to. A marriage can never survive, no matter how much you love one another, no matter how well your intentions were when you gave your vows. A marriage can never survive, ever, with only one covenant keeper. There must be two. Please never forget that. If you have endured divorce and suffered through remarriage, you've got to know something. The only way the covenant works is with two covenant keepers. God is so merciful and so loving and so kind. One of the basic principles about God, one of his characters that he always stresses more than any other character, is his loving kindness. He said his mercy is greater than his judgment. Yes, God hates divorce because he hates the cutting of covenant or the breaking of covenant. But the beautiful thing about God is what God hates is what God creates as a way out for his children from a horrible marriage. What God hates is divorce. And yet I'm fixing to teach you that what God created is a legitimate divorce for his people. How can this be so? Because Yahweh has two wills. He has a perfect will and he has a permissive will. And if we all walked according to his commandments, we would never need a divorce. We would be in his perfect will. But he's so loving and kind that he knew his children would mess up. He knew they would make horrible mistakes. And rather than giving them a death sentence, he gave them a punishment called divorce. And then he gives them the legitimate way to accomplish that divorce. Our Bible study today is going to begin with our search for balanced truth. 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 9. The law is not made for a righteous man, but rather for the lawless and the disobedient. Here's the plain and the simple fact. If you're a righteous man, you won't need any law whatsoever. Why? Because you'll love your neighbor as much as you love yourself, and you'll love the Lord your God with all your heart, and you'll live a good, righteous, holy life. You'll treat your wife right. You'll get up and go to work. You'll provide for her. Why? Because you made an agreement with her to do all of those things. You're a righteous person. So therefore, God didn't need to make a law for you because there's a law written in your heart. It's called the law of righteousness. But for every other person that's not walking in righteousness, a law had to be created because of the rebellion of men's hearts. If all men were perfect, there would be no need for a law. For the laws would be written in all of our hearts. We would be totally incorruptible. Many of us married very young in life. I married at 19 years old. Before having these laws written in our hearts, before knowing the right ways of God, we married as animals, if you will, in heat, still filled with human passion and selfishness. The purpose of marriage is to teach us the ways of God. It gives us an opportunity to learn how to forgive one another and love one another in spite of each other's weaknesses, in sickness and in health. All of these are designed to create what was not in us to begin with in marriage. Marriage is a great experiment in practicing for the millennial reign, when we will love everyone. That's what marriage is designed to do in all of our lives. Do you remember David? He broke one of Yahweh's laws. It was called the law of the shewbread. God's perfect will was, David, you're not supposed to eat the shewbread. That's only for the tribe of Levi, which was the priest. Yahweh saw that David was hungry, and David went to the temple out in the wilderness, the tabernacle, and when he got there, he told him, he said, "Get me the bread off the table of the Lord." Well, they were scared to do that. It was against the law of God. It was not God's perfect will for David to do that. But God knew that David's situation needed a special circumvention of his law. And David ate the bread off the table of the Lord against the perfect will of God. But because God is loving and kind, he did not kill David. He knew David was hungry. He knew that all of David's men was hungry. And their hunger was more important to God than God's own law. God made a provision for those that were not walking in his perfect will. So what is God supposed to do in a situation where your partner refuses to honor the law of God? He refuses to honor the covenant of God. What is God supposed to do? He's supposed to hold you to that marriage forever and just tell you, "Oh, well, too bad, so sad, so sorry, I'm sorry to hear that. Good luck with that in the future." You know, the church would have you to believe that if you marry someone and you find out that the entire person that you thought you was marrying was a total different person. Let's just say that the man you married told you he was a millionaire, acted like it, showed you his money in the bank, that he could take care of you. Come to find out he didn't have a dime to his name. It was all a lie. You didn't marry a broke person. You married a lie. According to the church, good luck with that. Or let's say you marry a man and he comes in one day and he says, "Sweetheart, I'm sorry, but I'm attracted to men more than I am women, and I'll see you later." According to the church, good luck in the future. Sorry, you married the wrong person. Or another man comes in and you find out he's a child molester. According to the church, so sorry, that's your husband until you die. I could go down the list. A man beats you night and day to a bloody pulp to where you can't even see out of your eyes anymore. You go talk to the preacher and he says, "Well, pray about it, that God will change him." Well, there's nothing wrong with that. Don't misunderstand me. But they tell you to stay in that marriage and stay there forever and good luck in the future. What kind of an answer is that for real lives? Real people that have to go on living. There is no answer. But where the church has failed to answer you, today you're going to hear the voice of God answer you from His Word. God is not going to hold you accountable for the failure of your partner to honor the marriage covenant. God's nature is just and fair. You tell me what's just and fair about a young mother with a house full of children being abandoned by a man that made a covenant with her to provide for her, leaves her with all the children starving to death, forces her to have to go marry somebody or live with somebody to have a place for her children, and you're going to tell that woman she's living in sin. You need a checkup from the neck up. The God we serve, no, He didn't want any of that to happen, but it did. And just like He didn't want David to eat the showbread off the table, but He did. And the justice of God and the fairness of God always provides for a permissive will. I want to take you back to the beginning, since Jesus, Yeshua, talks about the beginning, and I want to show you the pattern that Yahweh set. Remember, God always follows a pattern. Now, before we can go back to the beginning, I want to talk to you about a book that really helped me in this study. I'm going to show it to you. This book here, I did not know about this book, but come to find out, every police officer that's ever been to the police academy, every lawyer that's ever been to law school, or studied the law in any shape, form, or fashion is familiar with this book that I hold in my hand. It's called The Laws of Moses and the Code of Hammurabi. I'm going to try to zoom in on that for you so you can see the title of the book. I got it off of Amazon. You need to order it. Now, it's a hard read. It's not an easy read. The print is super small. It's a very difficult read. But I learned some things in this book that I did not quite comprehend before. Before Abraham was ever called out of the land of the Ur of Chaldees, there was a great society on planet Earth. We have records all the way back to the people of Shem, to the Semitic people. We have documents, we have things that show us how those societies lived. And we seem to think of those days gone by way back as lawless days. But I was shocked to find out about a nation, not a nationwide, but a society-wide law that was in existence even before Abraham was told the laws of God, or Moses, actually. So that law, it was a worldwide law. I say worldwide as far as there were people on the planet in those days. Before God gave Torah to Israel, there was a law given to mankind. Its origins are a bit mystical. If you study about the Code of Hammurabi, you will find out that there are some statues that we have to this day. I'm going to put them on the screen for you that sort of show that this Code of Hammurabi was given divinely to mankind. And it's shockingly close to the law called Torah. Now, there was a worldwide common law that generally governed the early world that all good people abided by. We're going to look first at the ancient Babylonian law, the Code of Hammurabi, and then compare it with God's law. Now, why would we do that? Who even cares about the Code of Hammurabi, Brother Vaughn? Our authority is the Torah, or the Word of God. I'm in full agreement with you, 1,000%. My purpose in bringing out the Code of Hammurabi, number one, you're going to see how divorce and marriage has been a concern from the most ancient of civilizations. And to think that Yahweh would not give an even better law than the Code of Hammurabi to Israel concerning this subject would be a mistake. Now listen very carefully. Your Bible without the Torah is so incomplete, it doesn't even have a foundation. The God of Israel never changes. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. To say that Yeshua came to earth and did away with the Torah, or the law of God, his Father, is so close to blasphemy, I can't think how you can get any closer. So for us to get an understanding of what Yeshua meant when he talked about divorce and remarriage, we've got to go back not only to the Torah, but before the Torah, the Code of Hammurabi, and we're going to see when we do that what the Torah corrected about this code that was there when Abraham was born. If you'll look on your screen, you'll see the Code of Hammurabi. We have them in museums today. This was a law written in stone. And there was one of these cylindrical stones in every city of the Mesopotamia, throughout Babylon, throughout all of the known world at that time. It was in the city center, or at what's called the gate of the city. You could find these codes of Hammurabi positioned in all of these towns, including the town that Abraham lived in, which was the land of Ur of Chaldees. This law set in the city center of the town Abraham grew up in, knowing this particular law. It was not a perfect law. Torah is a perfect law. This was the best they had concerning divorce and remarriage. Now, the Code of Hammurabi is a well-preserved Babylonian code of law of ancient Mesopotamia. It's dated to about 1754. It is one of the oldest deciphered writings of significant length in the world. The sixth Babylonian king, Hammurabi, enacted this code. According to Hammurabi's code, a marriage was a simple contract. Now, pause. You may wonder why I'm focused on the law of Hammurabi. Because if you're like I used to be, you would be saying, I want to know what the Bible says. We're getting there. But let's lay this foundation of what a marriage always was from the days of Mesopotamia and even before. A marriage was always a contract. Always. And if you don't get that in your mind, you're not going to understand marriage and divorce. Marriage was, is, and always will be a contract. It was so before Abraham was born. And it was only valid if it was written. You couldn't just say the vows, you had to write them. Today in Israel, they call that the ketubah, or the marriage contract. The marriage license is an assertion and an attestation sign that you have given these vows to one another. It's only valid. And what's so amazing to me about the Code of Hammurabi is when you see how exact it is with our marriage ceremonies today, the marriage license, everything that goes back to this Code of Hammurabi. So it was only valid if it was written and sealed and witnessed. How many's ever been married? You did what? You signed a contract, and then who else had to sign it? A what? A witness. It all comes from the law of Hammurabi. Now this is amazing to me because when it comes to God's law, the Ten Commandments, what did he do? They always existed. The law of God was not created on Mount Sinai when they were given to Moses. They existed 450 years earlier. We know because God told Abraham 450 years before Moses, because you obeyed my law and kept my commandments, all of my ordinances. What laws, what commandments, what ordinances? The ones that always existed. But what God had to do in order to use those commandments to judge us at the judgment was to write them down. The Apostle Paul says that he wrote them down that we might all be condemned. It's amazing. So this Code of Hammurabi was only valid when written, signed. That's why Yeshua had to come and seal the new covenant in his what? Blood. That his death was his signature. It's a beautiful thing. Now, that's you can read that right now. You can go to London to the museum and read the Code of Hammurabi on that stone. When you get to paragraph 128, you'll find out where these marriage laws originated from. In the Code of Hammurabi, divorce was allowed, but treated in different ways, depending on which party broke the contract. If the wife was guilty, he could divorce her with words. All he had to do is say, I put you away. And they were divorced. But he could never send her away empty-handed. In this book, on page 120, paragraph 141 of the Hammurabi Code, this is the law that's written in that code. Stay with me. When you see the Code of Hammurabi, you're going to see what Torah did. Torah comes in and corrects the injustices to the wife. Listen carefully. This is what the Code of Hammurabi says. If the wife of a man who is living in his house has set her face to go out, or in other words, has determined to leave and act stupid, if you will, and has wasted her house, neglected her husband, one can bring her to justice. Why can we bring her to justice? Because all contracts can be brought to justice. If you break a contract, you can go and get justice. Marriage is a contract. And if her husband formally divorces her with the words, "I repudiate her," she goes her own way and receives no izubu. I'll explain what that means in a moment. But if the husband does not pronounce this formula and takes another woman, then this woman must remain in his house as the new wife's servant. Now, there was problems in the Code of Hammurabi that Torah corrected. Here was one of those problems. If that man puts the woman away, he will not divorce her. He will not give her the words, "I divorce you." That causes that woman to never be able to remarry. She must stay in his home as a servant to the new wife if the woman is at fault. In other words, let's say in those days a woman committed adultery or went out and wasted all the family money, broke the contract. The husband, if he decided that he was not going to be her husband anymore and refused to divorce her, then she was his servant and the new wife's servant whenever he got a new wife. Now, let's look at some of the details of the divorce laws of ancient civilization. The wife had the right to divorce her husband if her husband had violated the what? The marriage contract. However, this was very risky for the woman to do, because if the court should find her to be the guilty party, she was thrown in the water and drowned. Now, where do we know that from? From paragraph 142 and 143 of Hammurabi's Code. Therefore, very few women were willing to take their husbands to court for breaking the marriage contract. But when the husband was at fault, the law made sure that the wife was taken care of because of the following. The law was generous with her and took pains to provide for her support. If she had no children, her husband was to give her her dowry back. In other words, in those days, a woman's family gave a dowry to the husband, which was the bride price. If he was at fault and it was proven in the court, then the family would get their money back, which was just and fair. The dowry was the portion of her father's wealth given to her when she married. Although she brought the dowry with her into the husband's house, it was tied to her for life and was never the property of the husband. In other words, a father would give his girl away and give her her inheritance to the husband as a way to provide for the wife, but that was only his as long as he had the wife. Okay? So according to the Code of Hammurabi, if he puts her away and he's at fault, that money goes back to her. So there, in those days, the law is being just and fair. Now, this is so important. The wife was never intended to be the provider or the money earner. She was never intended to work. The dowry was for her to be taken care of. But If the husband broke the contract and divorces her, the money goes to her for support after the divorce. So she would have a way to get a home, provide for her children. So this has always been the purpose of the law, is to protect the weaker members of our society. In those days, the wife was the weaker member. She did not have a provision. So therefore, the husband was required by law to give her her dowry back to take care of her. Now, on the other hand, if the divorced wife had children, and if the husband was the guilty party, it was handled differently. She received her dowry, of course, but in place of the bride price, she was instead to have use of her husband's property and food from his field or his garden. This served as alimony and child support. In those days, if they had children together, not only did she get her bride price back, but she was able to use the house, get food from the garden, grain from the fields. There was more rights that came to her if she had children. So if you ever wondered where child support and alimony came from, it came before the Torah. It comes from this ancient law that very few of us know anything about. Now, if a man should be captured and deported. In those days, if they fought a war, a tribe would come in, start a war, and take the men as slaves. Now, a strange thing happened here. This is very important because when you get into the New Testament, you're not going to understand something that Yahweh says if you don't understand what I'm about to tell you. So the husband would get captured and be carried off as a slave for God knows how long. And here's his wife now with all the children and no means of support. In those days, there was no food stamps. There was no Social Security. There was no American government. You was on your own. That was it. The wife, according to the code of Hammurabi, was allowed to remarry because she had lost her support. However, according to the code of Hammurabi, not the Torah, God's going to change this. But according to this code, if he returned from captivity, she had to go back to him. Even though she's remarried, in love with another man. But here's the worst part. When she went back to the first husband, she would leave any children from her second marriage with their father. That's in paragraph 133 of this code. Now, this is very sad, and this is something that Torah was going to correct. Because in the Torah, it's totally different. Why? Because Torah is the perfection or the perfecting of this code that was already in existence. Sad situation. The man goes, comes home. That's still his wife, but she had to remarry to provide. But she's got to go back to him and leave all of her children with that father. Now, if a man deserted his wife, not captured, but just abandoned her, she had the right to remarry, and if her former husband returned, then he had no claim on her. Now, according to the church, that's her husband till he dies. But according to this code, no. You have no right to her if you abandon her and she remarries. According to Torah, you have no right to her if you abandon her. However, according to the modern day church, that's your wife forever. Even if she's remarried, legally in God's eyes, that's still your wife. We're going to correct all of that today. You got to stay with me. Please don't leave. Just force yourself to watch it to the very end so you can learn. Now, something else very interesting about the Code of Hammurabi. The only prohibition against divorce, the only way you could not divorce was if your wife was sick. Let's just say she had gotten sick and she could not perform sexual relations. You could not divorce her according to this code. But you could take a handmaiden that could perform for you so that you could continue the family line. That's on paragraph 148 of the Code of Hammurabi. Now, that was a good 20 minutes talking about a code that might seem unimportant to you. And I understand. It's a little deep. But from here forward in this lesson, you're going to find a merciful God. Remember we talked about in the beginning a balance, how God's main character trait is loving kindness, justice. You're going to find the injustices of this code that was in the whole of society. Every king, every nation abode by this moral standard. But God is about to introduce to His people, not the rest of the world, not the rest of the people that's living by the Code of Hammurabi, but to His people Israel, with a man named Moses. He is going to step in and give a perfect law, a better law that comes from the mind of Yahweh into the hands of Moses. It's going to correct this law. And therefore, you find the purpose, or therein, you find the purpose of the Torah. Yahweh's law, Torah, pre-existed the Code of Hammurabi. There's no doubt about it. But it had been forgotten. After the flood, Shem and his son Eber migrated to Canaan land and built the city of Jerusalem. Here Shem appears under the title of Melchizedek, the king of righteousness. The book of Jasher calls him Adonizedek, Lord of righteousness. In the book of Jasher, he is called the same thing. I'd like to read to you. You may not be familiar with the book of Jasher. It's okay. It was in your Bible before it got tampered with. But book of Jasher 16 and 11, it says, And Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem, the same was Shem, went out with his men to meet Abram and his people with bread and wine, and they remained together in the valley of Melech. And Adonizedek blessed Abram and gave Abram a tenth of all that he had brought. And Abram gave this Melchizedek all that he brought from the spoil of his enemies, for Adonizedek was a priest before God. Now, Shem, which was a descendant of Noah, knew the law of God. He knew Torah. He knew the perfect law. Knew it well. He was taught it by Enoch, his grandfather, Methuselah, Noah. The title of Adonizedek or Melchizedek was continued in Jerusalem or Salem even after the line of Shem was overthrown by the Canaanites sometime prior to the Israelite invasion under Joshua. Now, in Joshua's day, we read that the king of Jerusalem was still called Adonizedek. We know that from Joshua chapter 10 and verse 1. Though by now the rule was in the hand of Canaanite usurpers. Shem continued to obey and observe the laws of Yahweh and to rule the people by the Torah. After his death, the people and the judges began changing and watering down the laws of God as taught to them by Noah's son Shem. Shem apparently had some sort of educational facility or college to teach the Torah and the ways of God. For the book of Jasher 24 and 17 tells us that Isaac, son of Abraham, went there after his mother died. Let's read that verse in Jasher 24:17. And when the days of their mourning passed by, Abraham sent away his son Isaac, and he went to the house of Shem and Eber to learn the ways of Yahweh and his laws. And Abraham remained there 3 years. So according to the book of Jasher, Isaac went to the school of Torah under Noah's son and grandson, Shem and Eber, who had kept the Torah alive in Canaan land just after the flood. So, if that's the case, and according to the book of Jasher it is the case, what happened? What happened to Torah? Well, both laws existed side by side during the days of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Remember, Isaac went to the school of Torah, but Shem has now died, Eber has now died, and that law of Torah is becoming a relic of the past. However, it still existed, because remember what God told Abraham 450 years before the return of Torah to Mount Sinai. God told Abraham, because you kept my laws, you kept my covenant. We never knew how Abraham could have been keeping Torah when Torah did not come to us until 450 years later. Here's your answer. Abraham knew the Torah, because Isaac went to the school of Shem and Eber, and therefore Abraham was there with him for 3 years. So this is how he kept Torah. He knew Torah. Hallelujah. Now you might know why he was called a friend of God. Now, even though these laws existed side by side, one belonged to the righteous seed line, the Torah. But this other law belonged to the carnal world. Torah belongs to the righteous seed line. This law is the law of the land. This was the common law of most of the world, including Canaan now. Now, during Israel's sojourn in Egypt, God's law, remember, Abraham knew the law, Isaac, Jacob, but the children of Jacob, they literally forgot the law while they were in Egypt. It was already being forgotten during the days of Jacob. Isaac was probably the last one to be a great defender of Torah, but it was passed down in some form or another. God's law was forgotten while they were living in Egypt. Now you might know why he told them immediately coming out of Egypt, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. How could they remember? Because their family had kept Sabbath. Their grandpa Isaac went to the school of Shem. Shem was a Sabbath keeper. Noah was a Sabbath keeper. Now, if you'd like proof of that, there's a video on my YouTube channel that's titled Noah, the Sabbath Keeper. You need to watch that. Now, because the law was forgotten, it became necessary for God to teach his people once again the law of Torah. They had it previously, but now it was going to be returned to them through Moses. Now, we're about to come on a subject here that I think deserves our attention. It's often been said about Torah that it does not deal with enough. There's 613 laws, and surely there's more situations that we would all face than those 613 laws could provide for. So we ask the question, why didn't God give us more instruction? If God would have given lawful judgments or decisions or ordinances on every different situation that was to arise in the course of history, the law books could not contain and could not have been born by the entire nation of Israel. If God would have given a law as so large as what was needed They couldn't have even carried all the law books with them in their journeying through the wilderness. So we must realize to some extent, rather than being an exhaustive law code, the Torah gives the basic moral principles of life, especially in the Ten Commandments, and then continues with a few hundred specific statutes to define the principles of the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments gives us the 10 principles, if you will. The Torah breaks those down and gives some legislative definition to their meaning. But it's imperative that we realize that often Yahweh merely corrects the errors of the Hammurabi code in the Torah. They already had a common law that was not bad. It wasn't a horrible law. It just wasn't a perfect law. Had a lot of good things. Remember, we just read how the husband was to take care of the wife, give her a divorce, give her alimony. That's all good stuff. So therefore, Torah doesn't have to talk about a lot of these things. They were known. Remember, what's understood need not be explained. There was things that God did not have to deal with. It was already written down. Now, where there was nothing to correct, please mark this down. Where there was nothing to correct, God, Yahweh, did not elaborate. Since custom already dictated that which was right, it is our job now to study the principles given to us and apply them to every situation that we face today, notably divorce and remarriage. This is the key to biblical understanding. Take the principles and find out how they apply to your situation that you're going through in your own particular life. Now, we have discussed the Code of Hammurabi and some of the laws concerning marriage and divorce. And now you might understand why the Old Testament, the Torah, is not an exhaustive law about marriage and divorce. The reason is quite simple. They already had a good law, not a perfect law, concerning marriage and divorce. Where it was imperfect, Torah will correct it. Now, we must remember that Yahweh never changes. So this is important. The God of the Old Testament cannot say one thing about divorce and remarriage, and then in the New Testament change and say something else. He just cannot do it. So to understand divorce and remarriage, we make our mistake beginning in the New Testament. We have to come back. We have to look at Torah. And then take Torah, because Yeshua said, if any man thinks he came to take away the Torah, that man would be called least in the kingdom of God. He said, I'm not going to change one jot or one tittle, but I'm going to expound it and show you what it meant in your everyday life. A conditional contract or covenant is one that specifies conditions that both parties must fulfill. If one party breaks the contract, the wrong party may sue at law for damages or annulment of the contract. By definition, marriage contracts are conditional contracts. There's a lot of revelation right there. When you begin to see this, then the New Testament is going to make sense for you. It was always so in ancient times, beginning with the most ancient law, going to the most perfect law. Nothing changed in these laws. Contracts were conditional. And in this respect, the Code of Hammurabi is in total agreement with the Torah. Both the Torah and Hammurabi Code specifies contracts and their insolubility unless the contract is violated. Divorce, that is, a complete break in the marriage contract, is lawful. It's not desirable, it's not preferred, it's not perfect, but it is lawful in the eyes of God, because virtually all marriage contracts involve vows made by how many parties? Two. If divorce is a sin, mark this down, then your God, Yahweh, Jehovah, is a sinner. God holds you to a higher standard than He Himself can abide by? Hardly not. He's a wonderful God. He's a merciful God. He's a just God, and He loves you. And He's sorry for the situation that your life has brought to you. Many times consequences of your own choices. Many times it's not. Many times somebody didn't keep the contract. Well, Yahweh, your God, is a divorced God. And let's take a look at His marriage, and let's see what happened. In God's marriage to Israel on Mount Sinai, Israel, the bride, agreed. She came into a covenant. She signed a contract with Yahweh. She agreed to submit to His authority and obey His laws. You can find that in Exodus 19, 3 through 8. Yahweh, on the other hand, also entered into covenant. He agreed to give them the kingdom and the blessings of the birthright. This included honor, protection, provision, and children. Genesis 12, 1 through 3. However, Israel, the wife, broke the contract. Remember, if the terms of a contract are broken, a contract no longer exists. Israel violated this contract, being incapable of obedience to her God. She refused to repent, and therefore her husband divorced her. First, he put her away and gave her a space to come to her senses. He gave her time to repent and come back home. She refused. She abandoned him. He had the right to divorce her. And then he sent her out of his house. Jeremiah chapter 3 and verse 8. Right now, we're coming to a climactic point in this lesson. What is that point? The difference between two words. Now, these two words change the entire subject of divorce and remarriage. Before God gave me this revelation, I didn't know the difference in these two words that we're going to talk about now. What are those two words? Divorce and putting away. Word number one is divorce. Words number two is putting away. This is the key. If I had a key, I would hold it up for you. This is the key in understanding the words of Yeshua and Paul in the New Testament. Putting away is not the same as divorce. Now today in our society, we call putting away separation. The words separation and divorce are completely different in the Torah. Now notice in Jeremiah chapter 3 and verse 8. Let's read that real quickly so that I can help explain to you the difference between these two words, because without the understanding, you will mess up the New Testament. And I saw, Jeremiah 3 and 8, when for all the causes whereby backsliding Israel committed adultery, I had put her away. And these are two separate events. First, I did what? Put her away. We separated. I gave her a notice. I gave her a chance. I put her away. We separated. and I gave her a bill of divorce. Two separate things happened here. Yahweh told her, get it together. She didn't get it together, so he did his next thing that he allows for. He gave her a divorce. So, here's my question to you. Is putting away the same as divorce? Absolutely not. This understanding is going to help us clear up the confusion from the words of Christ and the words of Paul in the New Testament. Now, this is in accordance with the law of divorce and remarriage, as you can find in Deuteronomy chapter 24. In that chapter, Yahweh's Torah clears up some of the wrong injustices from the code of Hammurabi. Now, Hosea chapter 2 and verse 2, let's see what that says. I want to read it together. Turn with me to Hosea chapter 2 and verse number 2. Plead with your mother, for she is not my wife. Now hold on. According to the modern day church and according to the words of Paul, a woman is a man's wife as long as he liveth. She's bound to her husband as long as he lives. So in other words, if a woman leaves her husband and even remarries, according to Paul, supposedly, that's still his wife. Well, here is Yahweh saying something totally different. He says, tell Israel, to whom he was married at one time, that you are not my wife. There comes a time when a wife is no longer the wife. When is that time? At the point of divorce. And neither am I her husband. They're both still alive, right? Israel's alive, Yahweh's alive, and he says, I'm not your husband anymore, and you're not my wife no more. Well, how does that line up with Paul's teaching that says the woman is the man's wife until both of them's dead? Well, no, because God never changes. You can't have it one way in the Old Testament and another way in the New Testament. It just won't work. Neither am I her husband. Let her therefore put away her whoredoms out of my sight, and her adulteries between her breast. Now, God's divorce meant Israel was no longer his wife. This disproves the doctrine called the eternal covenant of marriage. The Mormon church teaches that. Many other groups believe that marriage is indissoluble. Because from the beginning, marriage was meant to be forever. I agree. But from the beginning, there was not supposed to be murder either. But because we are not in the Garden of Eden, and because we are not in the millennium, God made provision for us, just like he did for David with the table of showbread. Divorce is not sin, but it can be called sin. What do I mean by that? Let me explain. God himself is a divorcee. So we can safely say that divorce itself is not a sin. But it can be a sin, of course, if the one demanding a divorce does so with evil motives that are not in the law of God. But the fact that God divorced Israel shows that lawful divorce is the result of what? Sin. So no, divorce is not sin, but it is the punishment for sin. That's how we started this lesson, that divorce is a punishment. Some of you were looking at me like, what do you mean divorce is a punishment for sin? Somebody sinned. Somebody was selfish. Someone had an evil heart. Someone broke covenant. Therefore, the divorce is the punishment for a sin or a violation of the contract. It is the final solution to the problem when all else fails, and when reconciliation is impossible, God's law on divorce and remarriage is plain. Let's read it. Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 4. Now remember, this is the God that never changes. Jesus did not change one dot of the law of God. Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 4. Let's see what it says. When a man takes a wife and marries her, and it comes to pass that she finds no favor in his eyes, because he has found some uncleanness in her, then let him write her a bill of divorcement, and give it in her hand, and send her out of his house. I want you to notice the word write her a bill of divorcement. There's a huge difference here from the Code of Hammurabi. Before the Torah came along and perfected it, all a man had to do was give a verbal divorce. All he had to do was say, I put you away. I divorce you. But God saw that was not perfect. And I'll explain why in a minute. So in Torah, he says, no more of that. There's a flaw in the Code of Hammurabi. My Torah is going to perfect it. So he says, now, instead of verbal, I want you to write down a bill of divorcement for her. And when she is departed out of his house, she may go and be another man's wife. I don't understand how we can read these two verses and see where God, number one, authorizes divorce and then authorizes remarriage and have anything else to discuss about it. This is Torah. This is His law. But the problem is we don't study Torah. We just study Jesus, the words of Jesus. And without an understanding of Torah, we murder the words of Jesus, as I'm going to prove in just a few moments. Verse 3, and if the next husband hates her and writes her a bill of divorcement and gives it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the last husband die, which took her to be his wife, her former husband, which sent her away, may not take her again to be his wife. After that she is defiled. For that is an abomination before the Lord. And thou shalt not cause the land to sin. Verse 5. When a man's taken a new wife, he shall not go out to war. Did you ever wonder why God put that in His Torah? He's correcting the law of Hammurabi. Remember, in the Code of Hammurabi, if a man was captured at war, the wife had to find a new husband until he got back. God says, no, don't send a man with a new wife out to war. Neither any business, but he shall be free at home for 1 year. The Torah is perfecting the Code of Hammurabi. And shall cheer up his wife which he hath taken. And it goes on and on and on. I won't continue to read it, but you can. So you'll see here what Torah is doing. Perfecting a law that was imperfect. Only if one sin is greater than all other sins can divorce not be forgiven. Remember that. Only if it's the unpardonable sin can it not be forgiven. Let me make this clear. There must be a biblical reason for divorce. And guess what that biblical reason is? A false witness. When someone enters a marriage and makes a vow and breaks it, they've given a false witness. That is biblical. Let me give you an example. Let's say you marry a man, and that man refuses to work. He refuses to provide for you and your children. Y'all are sitting there living in the slums. You're fixing to have to all go live in a tent because he won't pay the light bill. According to the church, you are stuck in that situation. But he made a vow to provide for you. That's not providing, that's surviving. So according to God, that man is a covenant breaker. That's a biblical reason for divorce. Now, some interpret this verse 1 of chapter 24 that we just read, to mean that he can only divorce her if she's unclean, meaning adultery or fornication, before he married her. But the sentence for adultery was death, not divorce. Thus, the grounds for divorce in the 24th chapter must be something else. Since the grounds are not specified, it would appear that the common law needed no modifying. Therefore, it is helpful to look at the Code of Hammurabi for a list for the grounds of divorce. Let me just try to clarify that statement. It tells us in verse 1 that if he hates her and finds something in her that he doesn't like, then he can put her away. But the Torah really doesn't tell us what that means. We know it's not just fornication, as we've always thought, because he could actually stone her for that. So then we have to go to a law that was understood throughout the land as reasons for not favoring her. Now, there are several things that the Code of Hammurabi states as reasons for divorce. Number 1, cruelty. I want you to think about it. Let's say that your husband or your wife is cruel to you. Crueler to you than an animal. Abusive beyond words. Do you know there is nowhere in the Torah or the New Testament that allows you to divorce them for cruelty? And we have to wonder why. It's very simple. What's understood need not be explained. I repeat that like a broken record. Because in the days when Torah was given, it was understood in the common law grounds for divorce. And one of those grounds was, it's written in paragraph 184, cruelty. You could divorce for cruelty. Another one was slander or waste of family assets. That's right. You marry a man, he takes all your money, wastes it, leaves you in poverty, leaves everybody in poverty, owes everybody in the country. According to the Code of Hammurabi, that was a reason for divorce. So when we come into Torah, Torah doesn't correct that. He says if a man finds something that he doesn't like about her, he can put her away. What about running up needless debts, destroying the family, alcohol, drugs? The church would have you think you're stuck with all of that. But no, Torah did not correct these grounds that are plainly written in the Code of Hammurabi. Therefore, what's understood need not be explained in Torah. Yahweh cared about the woman's welfare more than the Code of Hammurabi did. Torah comes along because the Code of Hammurabi does not protect the woman like it should, but Yahweh does. Let's read Exodus 21, 10 and 11. You read it, I'll explain it. It tells us that the wife could divorce her husband for some offenses, but in addition to them, she could divorce him for lack of support, food, clothing, and what about sexual relations? Let's talk about that. There's nowhere in the Torah or the New Testament that really says you have grounds for divorce if your husband or wife won't have sex with you. The reason being, that was already common law. That's known, that's the purpose of marriage. What if they won't please you? Your physical needs. See, the church says that the man can't ever get remarried. He's got to stay with a woman that won't satisfy him. So therefore he goes and winds up committing adultery, but that's okay. Just don't divorce and remarry. It's a bunch of hogwash, isn't it? Let's read Exodus 21, 10 and 11. I think it'd be good for us to read that together. This is all part of the Torah. Exodus 21, 10 and 11. Why don't you share this teaching with someone? I think that'd be a good thing. Verse 10 says, and if he takes another wife, her food, her raiment, and her duty of marriage shall he not diminish. And if he do not these three unto her, then he shall go out free without money. Did you hear that? If he don't provide her clothes, her raiment, and her sexual needs, or she don't provide those in return, do you see what the Torah says? Free to go. The primary difference between Hammurabi Code and the Mosaic Law, or the Torah, is that God takes an interest in the matters of the heart. Hence, even if the outward grounds of divorce appear to exist, there may well be hidden motives and sinful attitudes are against the spirit of the Torah. Such things in the eyes of God would make that divorce unlawful. Let me explain. You can't just up and decide you don't want to be married no more and say, well, I have a right to divorce. In the eyes of God, it will never be right. You have some plain things that give you a reason. But you cannot cause your wife to commit adultery and then leave because she committed adultery. See, you're in violation of the spirit of Torah. Torah wants you to stay married. Jesus wants you to stay married forever. Your motives must be pure. Yahweh's law protects the woman. The divorce procedure differs in one very important area in the Torah. Whereas the Code of Hammurabi allows either the man or the woman to divorce the spouse with just a verbal agreement, God's law demands a written document called the Bill of Divorce. Hammurabi was careful to mandate that the marriage contract be written, but divorces were verbal. This was a horrible law. This was going to cause problems, and it did. So God solved the problem by making divorces written just like the marriage contract. And that's why we still go to court to get a written divorce today. One could easily imagine a situation where a man divorces his wife verbally, but nobody else heard the verbal divorce, whereon she remarries somebody else, and here comes the first husband in a fit of jealousy, saying, hey, I never told you were divorced. Well, now it's her word against his word. She's in adultery. Yahweh protects the woman by authorizing and commanding a written bill of divorcement. Yahweh's law is just. It also protects the woman in this area. By the written bill of divorce, a wife can produce that writing to prove that her former husband no longer has any claim on her. It is her security, and guess what? It is her license to remarry. Therefore, Deuteronomy 24:2, following on the heels of verse 1, states that once she has those divorce papers, she is free to remarry. This is from the God that never changes. So how do we get into the New Testament and all of a sudden God forbids remarriage because her husband's still alive? Well, this woman in Deuteronomy, her husband was still alive. Yahweh says that's not your husband. The moment he gives you that writing, Israel, you're no longer my wife. I'm no longer your husband because of this divorce. Divorce and remarriage was lawful. But if she were to remarry without those papers, according to Torah, she would be committing adultery. And this is going to bring us to the words of Yeshua in Matthew 5. It's going to make it all make sense. Hang tight. The truth is about to explode on you. Your eyes are going to come wide open. Now, we have covered a lot of ground in part 1 of this lesson. Part 2 is waiting for you. Just click at the end of this video and it will take you to the next part. Or you can look below the description of this video and it will bring you to part 2. When we get into part 2, everything that you have paid attention to in part 1 is going to cause the New Testament to fall out so plain before you. And you're going to just wonder, why didn't we ever see that before? I promise you, it's going to forever change your life.